consultant at renewable energy consultancy BVG Associates, and you recently completed a thesis on biodiversity net gain policies for your master's program on the green economy. First, tell us, why did you choose this topic?
Well, it's a fascinating topic, I suppose, and in the UK, we have 14 gigawatts of offshore wind that's already been deployed, and a development pipeline of around 100 gigawatts. So this has actually been flagged. Research into biodiversity net gain has been flagged as a priority research area by UK planning authorities.
Okay, and how did you go about this in your thesis?
Well, what I did was I did a systematic literature review using a standard methodology that's been developed for the environmental sciences. So I took a large research sample, I applied inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then I developed a sort of database so that I could question the papers that I was finding and draw conclusions from it.
Right, I think we have a few slides.
Yeah.
Can we show the slides?
So
there we go.
I think it's useful to go back over this, which was mentioned by one of the previous speakers before. This is the mitigation hierarchy. And you can see there on the left, there's a break-even point. And historically and currently, what happens when people try and build offshore wind farms is they try and minimize biodiversity losses to as close to that break-even point as possible. Where biodiversity net gain comes into this, that's step 4. And that's what we're looking to do in the future when we build offshore wind farms. And this is being driven by a lot of things, including the post-2020 framework on biodiversity. We're looking to hit net gains after wind farms have been developed. There's a lot of things driving this, and developers have committed to it. We heard RWE, they're committed to this from 2030. Ørsted has also committed to this. And we also see that these ecological criteria that try and deliver environmental gains are becoming more important in offshore wind auction mechanisms around the world. So this is becoming more important, but at the same time, this has never really been attempted in the maritime space before, delivering biodiversity net gains from development. So a useful first thing to look at here is to just try and get a feel for what do we already know about the impacts of offshore wind farms on biodiversity. There's an awful lot of research in this area, so this is just a sample that I took that I think is indicative. And what you can see here is that I've ascribed scores to these studies that talk about what are the impacts. So first thing we can see is that we know more about the impact of offshore wind farms in certain areas than for others, more about seabirds than for habitats, let's say. And the majority of papers here, I've actually scored them as neutral. What does that mean? That means that although they evidence a link between offshore wind and biodiversity, they stop short of actually ascribing a positivity or a negativity to that link. So there is a link, but we don't know what that means in practice for biodiversity. As we can see, some of the impacts are positive. This is largely due to the reef effect that was mentioned before that comes when you put large structures in the water. And if you just look down to the right, you'll see that most of this data is actually coming from desktop studies. It's not field data. It's not been gathered live in the field. This has been done a long way from offshore wind farms. So there are programs that are underway. We heard about a couple of them before that are trying to fill this data gap. And we've got a £50 million program in the UK called the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Program, and that's actively working to fill these gaps. So yeah, I think there's cause for optimism when we look at the existing knowledge base for this stuff. But what happens when we look at examples from the real world about where biodiversity net gain development practices have been implemented already? Bear in mind, this data does not come from offshore wind projects. It comes from different types of onshore infrastructure. But the picture is a lot more negative. There's limited, less research in this area, for starters. But as we can see down there on the right, most of this data is coming from real-world examples of biodiversity net gain projects that have been realized. And lots of this is negative. I've scored these as negative. What does that mean? It means that they are overtly pessimistic about the ability of projects when they're built to achieve biodiversity net gain, and they are overtly pessimistic about the strength of the current planning frameworks to deliver credible biodiversity net gains. So what's the reason for all this pessimism? There are a few things. I think one of the reasons is that when we've tried to deliver biodiversity net gains in the UK onshore, the Environment Ministry developed a tool, and this tool was given to project developers to assess biodiversity gains and losses so they could balance things out and hopefully achieve net gains. But this tool really does rely very heavily on, it's not a very robust mechanism, and it relies very heavily on expert judgment. So there was a poll of environment managers who were using this tool, and just 31% of the environmental managers who were using this tool and consultants could agree on how to categorize a single area of grassland in the UK. So tools like this, when you start to think about applying these crude tools to the offshore environment where data is often lacking, which is highly dynamic, you can see that there might be a problem. The second cause for pessimism during onshore projects that have tried this has been that the areas where offsets have been applied to achieve net gains have been fractionally small compared to the overall impacts or the overall development area of a project. So when early adopter councils in the UK that had put this onshore, when they reviewed all their plans, developers were essentially promising a 20% increase in biodiversity values using the government tool, while reducing green space by 38%. So that doesn't really seem like it's matching up very well. And more often than not, I think in 91% of the cases where net gain had been attempted onshore, developers all chose to deliver their own mitigations within their own development site. So what they did was they took marginal spaces within their development site, and they tried to increase the biodiversity of very small areas. So what this might mean is if you have a housing development, you build a hedgerow along the back of it instead of a field. And that gets you a lot of biodiversity credits, and then you can claim that you have delivered biodiversity net gain. This has come under a lot of criticism because it doesn't do anything to support the broader ecological networks that are so important to biodiversity. There are other reasons for pessimism as well. I think I'll just touch upon two of them quite quickly. One is there's a lack of independent and robust monitoring frameworks once people put these biodiversity net gain proposals forward. And another is the overall cost of achieving this in the marine space is estimated to be between 8 and 30 times higher than for achieving biodiversity net gains in the onshore space. One of the reasons for this is that when you try and do this onshore, you can draw on the help of community volunteers, create community projects. You can't do this when you're 200 kilometers out in the North Sea. So they're all some of the challenges. So overall, I'd say the picture suggests that we might be getting there on data, but there's an awful lot of work to do to ensure that we've got the right frameworks in place to deliver biodiversity net gains by the end of this decade.
Are there actually any developers that deliver these net gains?
Not yet, but there are positive examples from the industry about positive biodiversity examples. So Ørsted in the UK right now, it's just built a hotel offshore for a seabird called a kittiwake. So these hotels, seabird hotels, will hopefully be colonized, and that's part of Ørsted's offsets for its project. We've also seen shellfish restoration projects go ahead in the Dutch North Sea. That's a positive example, but I think where it's been done in the past, people ate the shellfish, so that's obviously not really achieving biodiversity net gains.
And do you think there's an alternative method? We've been talking about developers putting in place policies. Do you think the governments should take care of this?
Well, just one more thing on the previous question, right, which is that we are actually seeing a project developed now that will be specifically with the idea to create biodiversity net gains. It's developed by a consortium of Shell and Eneco, and it's called Ecovende, and it's in the Netherlands, and it should be online by 2026. So that's the litmus test. Do I think we should be doing anything different, or what can we do differently? I think, first of all, it would be really helpful if we had a standard framework across the industry that we could use, a tool to assess gains and losses. The designing of this tool would be a very complex undertaking, so that would be helpful. And then also, in time, I think perhaps delivering a lot of biodiversity benefits from single projects on site across small areas is obviously not a good thing. If you could use an environmental bank or an environmental fund to deliver offsets across a broader network, I think that would be very helpful.
Right. Okay. And the governments? Would they play a bigger role, or is that not such a good idea?
They could do. They could do. I know it's been done. I think in the UK, in the US, there's been state-run environment banks for, I think, wetland biodiversity improvements. But I'm not sure how successful they've been.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Patrick Browne. Thank you for sharing your results with us. Thank you for listening.